When getting better feels like selling out after narcissistic abuse, does taking good care of yourself feel like a chore that you better do or else? Do you feel bossed around internally to do what is expected? Or do you feel lazy or worse unless you are doing something meant to improve yourself? Well, sometimes a narcissistic parent takes a deceptive approach to abusing the scapegoat child. Instead of outright telling the child that they are worthless, the parent attacks the child supposedly on that child's own behalf. They claim the child does not know how to act properly, that these improper behaviors are going to get the child in trouble in the outside world if they're not corrected by the parent. And the scapegoat child is in a vulnerable position because they need to bond to their parent. So the child will work to do or not do whatever the parent attacks them for. A narcissistic parent may attack the child for not doing things that are otherwise positive. They may rage at the child for the supposed capital offense of not putting their plate in the sink after dinner, or scream at the child for being, say, 2 minutes late for dinner. A child in a loving home is not scrutinized in such a manner. Foibles like being a couple minutes late or leaving the dinner table without putting the plate in the sink are not grievous offenses. As a result, the child gets to come to their own conclusions about the importance of, say, being tidy or punctual. The scapegoat child has to be tidy or punctual in this example, or face the narcissistic parent's rage. Whatever the child has to do to avoid their parent's wrath will also feel coerced to the child. And at some level, the child may hate having to meet the narcissistic parent's unreasonable demands while having no say in the matter. Later, the scapegoat survivor can feel like they are betraying themselves when they do today what they used to be forced to do. And the trouble can arise when those things are otherwise good to do. So the survivor may find the expectation to be on time as unbearably oppressive, or the prospect of cleaning their home may feel enslaving. The survivor may try to stay loyal to themselves by not doing these things. In today's video, I address the impact of a narcissistic parent who masks their abusive treatment as something that is for the child's own good. For example, yelling at the child for not having proper table manners at dinner. This sets the scapegoat survivor up to later resent doing the things that are otherwise good to do. They can feel like they are betraying themselves. Recovery eventually allows the scapegoat survivor to see how they were betrayed in what the parent did to them, not what they are doing to themselves. And I'll use an extended case example to illustrate. Well, my name is Jay Reed and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. And in my professional and personal experience, I've worked to identify the fundamentals to the process of recovery. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 involves making sense of what happened so that you know the abuse was not your fault. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance from narcissistic abusers, whether that's emotional, psychological, or sometimes physical distance. And pillar number 3 is living in defiance of the narcissist's rules. It's also essential to find and participate in communities of people who can get, validate, and support you on this path. I have seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life after applying these pillars. And today's video falls under pillar number 1, making sense of what happened. Well, if you were a scapegoat survivor to a narcissistic parent or partner, then I encourage you to check out my free ebook on the topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as the Scapegoat, and it goes into other important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoat child or partner to the narcissistic abuser. Whether it's self-limiting beliefs about yourself that you must adopt to survive, or why the narcissistic personality is so geared to put those closest to them down. This ebook can help you realize how none of this abuse was your fault, but was rather the product of the narcissist's psychological and emotional problems. And you can find the link to the book in the description box below, or by clicking here. Narcissistic abuse that is supposedly for your own good. A narcissistic parent needs to feel superior to the scapegoat child. Otherwise, that parent can come into contact with their own feelings of worthlessness. So they see the scapegoat child as full of the flaws that the parent, again supposedly, does not have. One way a narcissistic parent asserts their superiority is attacking how the child takes care of themselves. The parent scrutinizes the child for the slightest mistake in, say, table manners. In attitude and action, they rail at the child for being so lazy or sloven. They may accuse the child of not brushing their teeth before bed. They may infantilize their teenage child by asking if that teenager has washed their hands upon leaving the bathroom. They essentially treat the child as being incapable of caring for themselves. By extension, the parent is superior to the child for, again, supposedly knowing better. Limit the narcissistic parent's wrath by any means necessary. The child is in a no-win situation that they must survive. They already feel deprived of the basic respect, appreciation, and love that all children need from a parent. And this puts the child in an ongoing state of dis-ease within. Something essential is missing in their world, but there is no help. Against this backdrop, the parent's contemptuous attack can feel unsurvivable. The child is already undernourished and is now being attacked by whom they might expect nourishment. To cope, the scapegoat child must find a way to limit their parent's hostility towards them. So if the parent targets the child's inability to take care of themselves, then the child must find a way to go along with this. They command themselves to, say, keep their elbows off the table at dinner time, or make their bed no matter what, and wash their hands kind of at all times. The child essentially has to boss themselves around internally to try to not give the parent a reason to attack them. And this gives the child hope of being spared their parent's scathing disapproval. And without this hope, the child might feel too anxiously vulnerable in order to be able to function. Somewhere within, though, the child likely registers that they are being forced to do these things. And like all human beings, they likely take great offense at the denial of their basic human freedom to choose. It is far too unsafe to voice this offense to the narcissistic parent. Only further attack or invalidation would occur. So this well-founded resentment has to be made unconscious. The child tries to make these conditions more palatable by convincing themselves their parent is right. Now the parent is doing the child a favor by criticizing them in these ways. They are giving the child a map for how to properly live that the child, again, supposedly would otherwise be lost without. Well, let's look at another anonymized case example. Alexis's father was narcissistic and kept himself emotionally afloat by acting as if he knew and deserved better than her. He relentlessly found ways to pick on her. If she cleared her throat, he would make a demonstration over how disgusting she was. If she was speaking to someone in public around him, he would later tell her that she mumbles. If Alexis got dressed for school, he would often tell her to go change her clothes because they supposedly didn't match. And if they were eating a meal, he would tell her that she eats too fast and is going to get fat that way. He would tell the same story about her not taking a shower for a week when she was 12 years old over and over to her and anyone that would listen. He'd criticize her posture if she was just standing still. "Alexis, you have terrible posture. Stand up straight," he would say. He'd always accuse her of having a messy room and say she could not see her friends until she cleaned it to his satisfaction. He was rarely satisfied. Her father curated an image of Alexis as sloven, messy, gluttonous, and an unclean kid. He got to seem like the paragon of organization, maturity, and discipline in contrast to her. For her part, Alexis was confused by his treatment. She knew she was smart, she got decent grades in school, so why couldn't she do the things that seemed so basic at home? She couldn't entertain at the time that she had a father who was propping himself up at her expense. Instead, she had to assume that she was stupid and prone to laziness. Her father was doing her the favor of then correcting these bad qualities for her. She grew wary of her own judgment because she anticipated that he would show her how poor it was. The only hope she had to limit his wrath in these ways was to make a show of how she was following his rules. If he saw her going out of her way to, say, spend hours cleaning her room, he would still feel the superiority he needed, but would not have to berate her overtly to get it. Same went if she was forcing herself to have good posture and then sort of asking him to evaluate her posture, or eating very slowly and making sure he noticed. Internally, Alexis felt pushed around by these coping strategies. She had to command herself to take these measures. If she balked, then she risked her father's degrading attacks all over again. She would often feel like a sellout to herself, and this led to a lower sense of self-esteem because integrity was a very important value to her. The aftermath. Resurrecting your resentment. Eventually, it may be possible for the scapegoat survivor to know how oppressed they feel. When no longer, say, dependent on the narcissistic parent, they can begin to take stock of their own quality of life. The survivor may see how their inner life feels like a series of commands that they must obey or else. And these inner commands often reflect what the survivor had to do in order to avoid the narcissistic parent's attacks. The survivor may have an inner narrative telling them that they are going to, say, be late for work. And as they wake up in the morning, they may grow increasingly anxious. They feel like they are running behind with every step of their morning routine. And their inner voice may be yelling more and more at them to hurry up. The survivor may grow to feel like they are cooperating with their oppressor when they do tasks related to their own self-care. So getting to work on time can feel like a feeble act of obedience rather than acting out their own value of timeliness. Cleaning their home can feel like something they must do or feel like a terrible sloven person. The narcissistic parent weaponized these tasks against them. Now it can often feel like the only reason to engage in these activities is to spare themselves the inner attack that they'll face if they do not do them. There is no real satisfaction to be felt yet. At this stage, the scapegoat survivor may recover a sacred form of protest. Instead of being left free to choose how they act, they had to do the parent's bidding. The survivor can now acknowledge that their worth is based on more than such obedience. And initially, the survivor may direct their protest at themselves. It's they who are telling themselves to do this or that. They who are supposedly betraying their humanity by telling themselves to hurry up all the time. The only way to resist can often be to defy these inner commands. And the survivor may show up, say, late to work or not respond to phone calls or texts. And these efforts are intended to restore their sense of freedom. Well, let's go back to the case of Alexis. In her mid-20s, she had obtained enough distance from a narcissistic father to reflect on how she felt in her own life. Until then, her inner world had to be a means to the end of limiting the dangers posed by him. She started going to therapy because she knew her life was just not working. She liked her therapist and felt that her therapist liked her. They forged a bond and she began talking about what her inner life really felt like. She said, when I get up in the morning, I feel like I have an endless amount of things I have to do. Clean my apartment, start work early, make breakfast. I know this is all normal, but it feels like someone is holding me by the neck to do these things. Like if I don't, I'll be a disgrace to myself and somehow maybe somebody else. Her therapist asked, "Does this seem familiar to you?" She said, "Well, yeah, I made my whole life about goals back since I was 12. It made life seem possible. Just, get the next good grade, do the next workout or the next chore. It seemed like that gave me kind of a fighting chance." The therapist asked, "Against what or who?" She said, "Seemed like me and the world." Her therapist said, "It also sounds similar to how insistent your father would be on doing his bidding. You had to treat yourself in the demanding way he treated you in order to protect yourself." As treatment proceeded, Alexis felt a sense of acceptance from this therapist. She felt like she had someone who could understand her on her terms, maybe for the first time in her life. This helped Alexis feel safe in looking at and questioning the commands that she had formerly used to get by. And for about a year, in a 5-year treatment, Alexis expressed her protest. She began to work out only when she wanted to. She allowed herself to be a few minutes late to her sessions and to work. She allowed herself time where she had nothing to do. And she would often find herself drawing during these times. At other times, she would feel uneasy. All of this was her protest against the inner tyranny of the commands of self-care. Recovery, relocating the betrayal from within to without. The process of recovery for someone who has endured this form of narcissistic abuse can take time. The survivor had to grant ownership of their abilities to take care of themselves to their narcissistic parent. And it can then take time, new relationships, and therapy to recover one's felt ownership of these abilities. The goal is to know that when they are, say, working to be punctual, it is because they value this quality. They no longer have to do this solely to avoid a harsh rebuke from themselves or someone else. Consider the tragic scenario where someone is abducted by human traffickers. Their captors regard the trapped person as their property and feel entitled to exploit them. If their captive does not comply, then they can face unbearable and likely unsurvivable punishments. In order to survive, the captive must leverage their sexuality to meet the demands of their captives. The captive no longer gets to feel like they own this part of themselves. And if, let's say, the captive escapes or the traffickers are brought to justice, then their relationship to the captive's relationship to their own sexuality will take time to restore. They may feel like they betrayed themselves by using their sexuality in the ways they had to in order to survive. Initially, they may avoid sexual contact with others. They may be too used to the inner scenario where sexual intimacy means being domineered, even enslaved. I bring up this very troubling example because in both cases of what's being talked about, and in these cases, something inherently good had to be handed over to somebody else. For the survivor of this kind of narcissistic abuse, it was their right to take care of themselves. And for the survivor of human trafficking, it was and can be their sexuality. So if and when the initial traumatic situation ends, both can feel initially betrayed by themselves. They may see their efforts to, say, be on time, or in the trafficking survivor's case, engage in sexual intimacy as selling themselves out. But with time and the experience of being treated as a deserving person in sort of new relationships and a new experience, the survivor gets to redefine how they were betrayed. It is important to gain distance from narcissistic abusers in one's current life. Living in defiance of the narcissist's rule of being undeserving is very important here too. And both pillars of recovery empower the survivor to see themselves differently. And I want to mention that my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse dedicates several videos to these two pillars of recovery. And in it, you learn the importance of distance from narcissistic abusers, how to identify safe people, and how to overcome common challenges along the way. You'll also learn how to defy the narcissist's rules of being undeserving. You can find the link to the course in the description below or by clicking here. The problem that the survivor gets to arrive at was not what they had to do or what they had to leverage to accommodate their domineering narcissistic parent. The betrayal occurred in that parent's dismissal of the child's right to be treated with respect and love. As this new definition of betrayal gets to take hold, the survivor can feel deeper compassion and respect towards themselves. And the part of them that figured out how to survive their narcissistic parent's betrayal of them is no longer at fault. So let's go back to how this played out for Alexis. In the latter 2 years of her treatment, Alexis was more used to the warmth, understanding, and empathy she consistently found in therapy. She began to see herself differently. First of all, she had a more clear picture of who she was. Having been used for so long by her narcissistic parent had made it hard to know who she was. Second, she began to like herself. She saw herself to be as deserving as anyone else. One day she said, I've been thinking about what I want for myself. Her therapist said, oh yeah? Tell me about that. She said, I want to be around people who treat me the way I feel in here. I want to respect my own feelings and the feelings of the people I care about. And there are certain goals at work I have that are meaningful to me. I feel like I want to reach them. The therapist said, well, it sounds like that is coming from a place in you that gets to choose. She said, yeah, I feel a lot less oppressed or kicked around inside these days. I get why I had to treat myself that way. It was the only way to get through an otherwise impossible situation. But the problem was how I was treated, not in the way I had to cope with how I was treated. Well, that kind of illustrates how Alexis kind of reclaimed what was, inherently good in her, the kind of ways she wanted to take care of herself, her kind of promotion of her own goals that had to be kind of abdicated to her narcissistic father. Well, thank you for tuning in this week. I hope you found today's video helpful around kind of showing compassion towards the part of yourself that maybe learned to readily accommodate to what's being expected, or even portray oneself as being unable to take care of themselves in order to placate the narcissistic parent, give them what they need, and the process of kind of reclaiming that for oneself. Again, I want to thank everyone for your continued support, participation, and comments around these videos and in the resources that surround this channel. And I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.